In this section, we're going to further explore conducting developmental assessments for young children in early intervention by examining the role that adaptive behaviour scales can have in that assessment. In particular, we're going to look at what constitutes adaptive behaviour scales, how they're administered, and how we might use them within an assessment or to constitute doing a better assessment. Again, when we look at what is a developmental assessment, in this section we are referring to that overarching or umbrella term for all activities that are conducted to determine how well a child is progressing for their age and if they may be presenting with a learning disability, general learning disability, and or with autism. It is a method for assessing how a child's development is compared to where it should be for a child of their age. And again, it's important to remind ourselves that the purpose of such an assessment is to identify what are going to be the best interventions or strategies to assist a child in bettering their development or helping in their development. So, what are adaptive behaviour scales? Well, fundamentally, they're questionnaires. They're questionnaires that divide a child's development into a range of different areas, or what are known as domains. For example, communication, daily living skills, which really means the activities of dressing, feeding, toileting, self-care, safety. Socialization, which often refers to a child's social development, their interaction, and development of appropriate social behavior known as pro-social behavior. And motor coordination, again often divided up into gross motor coordination, which really refers to our large body movements, running, jumping, climbing, kicking a ball, catching, and fine motor development, or really fine finger and hand manipulation, such as holding a pencil, drawing, colouring, painting, using scissors, tying up buttons, shoelaces. So in each of these domains, there are a range of questions that typically are ordered from those that we see very early in development up to those that are seen much later or older. And then these are completed most often by a parent or someone in a preschool that rates how well a child does on each of these skills. These then are scored, and from that we can make guesstimations or estimations as to a child's current ability compared to other children. So let's look at how we use adaptive behaviour scales or adaptive behaviour questionnaires. And the one we'll start with initially is the adaptive behaviour system, which is currently in its 3rd edition. So most adaptive behaviour questionnaires or scales are divided into broad domains such as communication, daily living skills, coordination. And within each of those broad domains or large areas, they are then further subdivided into subdomains that then are looked at individually. So for example, in the adaptive behaviour assessment system, there are 10 subdomains or sub-areas that are of communication, which involves your ability to talk, your ability to understand language, and also includes reading and writing for children who are older. Community use, which focuses upon a child's behaviour when they're in the community to remain safe, follow instructions, and behave appropriately. Functional pre-academics, which really focuses on the building blocks of learning that which you would require to function well within a preschool or a school. Home living, which involves participating in home life, engaging in behaviours that are about remaining safe. Health and safety has some elements of remaining safe, keeping safe, but also about how to manage illness or injury. So, for example, seeking help. Leisure focuses on, in young children in particular, more what we might think of as play skills, but also looks at how well a child engages in activities and how well they participate. Self-care refers to the very basic activities of everyday living, such as getting dressed, eating, feeding oneself, toileting, and other activities of managing routines, such as brushing teeth. Self-direction refers to skills that involve initiating and taking responsibility for activities, such as cleaning up and tidying, being motivated. The social subdomain focuses very much on interacting with other children, not just with conversation and play, but also engaging in the more influential social skills of taking turns, waiting, managing emotions. And then motor contains both fine motor and gross motor skills, which are collapsed together into the one. So in each of these domains, or subdomains, there's a range of questions. Again, they tend to order from that which is the most basic of skill, those that are seen in early infancy, right up to the much more sophisticated and developed skills that are seen in children who are much older. Usually the best kind of skills that you would see for a child of the age to which the questionnaire is aimed. What we find with most of the questionnaires is they have an age range. More and more we see with adaptive behavior scales that they don't cover all of childhood. They're broken up into areas such as 0 to 5, 6 to 11, and 12 to 18. And for each of these skills, you provide a rating. You either write in the number or circle the number that is next to the skill of how well the child can do. 0 typically reflecting that the child is not able to do it. They're not able to do it in any way, and the highest number, which could be 3 or 4, indicating that they can do this independently, that is, without help, and do it almost all the time when it's required. So again, looking at the adaptive behavior system, this would be a good example of one of the subdomains, of where there are about 25 separate questions or skills that are developmentally ordered, from that which is seen in early infancy right up to that which would be seen at the highest age. And in this questionnaire, that's up to about 5 or 6 years of age. So for example, you ask the question of a parent, or the parent completes the questionnaire of, does the child look at other faces when other people are talking? And you rate a 0, which would indicate that they're not able to do it at all, or 3, yes, they do it all the time. More questionnaires will have a segment near the end where you can put a tick or a cross to indicate that you're only guessing or you don't know the answer. This is a reliability check to ensure that scores are not being put in there that are referencing to skills where the parents don't really know what happened. What then happens is that this questionnaire is scored by the clinician and they're totaled up. So as you can see here in the communication, that if you were to get all 25 rated at its maximum, which is 3, that would give you a total score of 75. So when it's completed, you would add up what the score is and place it in there. That would give you a score out of 75. You would then write down the number of scores that were guessed or estimated, and this would impact on the way that you would score it. Similarly, when we look at adaptive behavior scales, this one is in the adaptive behavior assessment system for community use. You can see that the skills starting at number 1 are the ones that are expected at a much lower age, right up to those that would be expected for children who are much older and more able. What's important about each of these domains is their sampling skills. This isn't a representation of every skill that would be expected to be seen by a child. These ones are used to allow a snapshot of the kind of skills that might be seen of children at various ages. It's a way of drilling down. If we think of drilling in the geological sense refers to inserting a drill that takes a very small cylindrical sample of the local geography so that they're able to estimate what is underground. Similarly, adaptive behavior scales, rather than looking at every behavior or every skill or every milestone that you would expect to be demonstrated by a child, attempt to sample it. Again, looking at the way that we use standardized testing, if we come back to our running metaphor, that if we were to take 100 children, place them on a line and say, now run as fast as you can to the 200 meters where the other line was located, and we timed every child, somebody would come first, one of those 100 children would come last, and the rest of the children would come somewhere in between. And if we plotted that, what we would find is that a very few would be right up there with the child who came first. A very few would be very close to the child who came last, and the overwhelming majority would be somewhere in the middle. And this gives us what we refer to as the norm distribution curve. So adaptive behavior questionnaires serve the same function. They sample behaviors so that what we're able to do is to get scores of children in these separate domains: communication, community use, social, coordination. And by getting a score, we're able to identify at a child at any particular age where they'll come in that distribution curve, which is measured by the score they get out of the total possible score that's in that subdomain. Why this is important is these activities will be chosen quite deliberately to spread out those abilities as much as possible to try and get the most accurate norm distributed scoring possible. Again, we discussed this in the running metaphor of norm distribution curve, that if you were to get children to run only 20 meters, you would still get, with that theoretical 100 children, a distribution, but the timings would be much closer together, so harder to separate out where any one child was at. Whereas if you made it 200 or 300 meters, the times would be so spread out that it would be significantly easier to identify which child came first, which child came last, and which child was at any particular percentile, like the 10th percentile, 50th percentile, which is the middle person, or the 75th percentile, which means they came 25th. So similarly, they use these subdomain items, or these items that are placed within these subdomains, in such a way as to sample it. It does not represent every skill in all the aspects of community use. And again, this can be seen in the social subdomain, where they take skills from very early in infancy right up to the much more subtle social skills that would be seen in older children. If we look at item number 4, lift arms to express a desire to pick up, this is in fact a very important early social development skill, hopefully seen by 12 months of age, of where an infant understanding And once again, in the subdomain called self-direction, what we see are a range of skills from infancy right up to 5 years, 6 years of age, going right from showing interest in activities, in toys and activities, managing their emotions, right up to number 25, which is managing conflicts with others by talking it through, by discussing it. One of the things that you'll notice in all of these subdomains is they actually even consist of groups of skills. So for example, in self-direction, some questions relate to showing interest, others relate to managing unfamiliarity and not requiring adults for support to do that. Another are following instructions, and another are dealing with emotions and conflict. These represent smaller clusters of skills. This again can be seen in self-care, which refers to a variety of different skills such as sleeping, drinking and eating, dressing, and using the toilet. Within each of those specific skills, those skill areas, you could in fact ask a range of questions if you wanted to know how a child was functioning, if you were looking at what they were able to do and what they required help with. But the function of an adaptive behavior question is more as a snapshot sampling or a drilling to get scores that allow you to do an overall estimation of where this child's self-care skills are compared to other children of their own age. So whereas it has specific questions, its function is more geared towards standardized scoring. And again, standardized scoring refers to getting a score that you can then use in comparison to other children of the same age that allows you to place them on the norm distribution curve. So again, just as is standardized testing, where we administer in direct assessment tasks or requests to children to see how they respond and score it, we're doing the same with an adaptive behavior questionnaire, except we're doing it by asking parents or preschool staff to rate the child. So in each of these subdomains, you'll gain a raw score. Each of those subdomains has a different number of questions that can vary right from 20 to 30. Therefore, that would provide differences in the total score that would be possible in each of those subdomains. So again, if we come back to our metaphor for understanding norm distribution curves, it's like getting the children to run 200 meters and then do the hopping race and then throw a rock. You're getting different scores. So the way that we can then use them in a comparative way or add them together to find something out is we convert that to the standard score. And the standard score, which always will range from 1 to 19, is a way that we have a score that transfers across each of those different scales, each of those different ways of measuring, to identify how they compare. And again, reminding you, when we're talking about a standard score and comparing, this is directly equivalent to that percentile scoring. So for example, someone who gets a standard score of 19 is directly equivalent to the 95th to 100th percentile. Someone who gets a standard score of 1 is directly equivalent or equated to that percentile score of 1 or 2. So what they do with each of these subdomains is they take the scores. If you can remember in communication that the total score was out of 75. And for a child of particular age, that is say 3 years, 3 months, they simply take a certain number of children that they have administered this as part of the sample, let us say 1,000 children, and found where each of those 1,000 children scored. This will create a distribution curve of scores. Some children will have in fact done very high at 3 years, 3 months and got a score as much as 40, 45. A very small number of children would have got very low scores in single digits, and they would have formed the first and the 100th percentile. And what this means is you're then able to compare the score you got with this child through this assessment on that distribution curve to give you that percentile score compared to all the other children in the sample that was used in this test. They then translate that percentile into the standard score. So those children who scored in the 100th percentile allow you to give a standard score of 19. So for example, and this is purely illustrative and hypothetical, if at 3 years, 3 months of age, we found that the children who fell in the 100th percentile, the top, that 1% of best performance, that the score that they got in the adaptive behavior assessment sample when they first were devising the test in communication was 45. 45 then became the number for the standard score of 19. So it is worked backwards. They devise the standard score backwards after they've got the raw scores. And this is what allows us to use it in a standardized way. Again, in this context, we mean standardized as in the scoring system that allows you to place children on that norm distribution curve. It is also standardized, or adaptive behavior questionnaires are also standardized in that the questions are exactly the same for every child. So as in standardized testing, the Griffiths, the Bailey, the Whipsy or Whisk, where there are prescribed procedures of how you do this direct testing, the sentences that are used are precisely the same for every child. So once you have standard scores in each of these subdomain or skill areas such as communication, functional pre-academics, and self-direction, you can now compare this child's abilities to other children of the same age in that subdomain. So in the subdomain of communication, in the subdomain of functional pre-academics. What it also allows you to do then is to add these subdomains together that form these broader domains, conceptual ideas. So in the adaptive behavior assessment system, in the third edition, where there are 4 domain areas, these are made up as the totals of the scores from particular subdomains. If you looked at the social domain, this is constructed from the leisure subdomain and the social subdomain. If you look at the practical domain, this is made up of community use, home living, health and safety, and self-care subdomain. So at some level, it is in a hierarchy assumed that these subdomains can be brought together to form more broad skills. So we think in domains of development. When we look at an understanding of development, one of the things that we do is segment or carve out children into separate domains. So the sum of scaled scores represents adding those subdomain areas that have been clumped together because they conceptually seem to link or coalesce or go together to form some broader skill, such as social ability, practical ability. And you can add them together to create that composite score. And that composite score is simply an artifice, an arbitrary adding up of the subdomains to form a score to represent a child's ability in that broader domain, for example, social ability or conceptual ability. And then you look in the tables in the back of the manual, and that will then give you the percentile rank. And that percentile rank is simply looking on that norm distribution curve and by that score identifying where this child would fall in that percentile ranking from 1 to 100 by the scores that all other children that were used in the sample got that were of the same age. Now, confidence interval, which again we've talked about in standardized assessment, is a really important concept. In fact, it is often not given due significance. The confidence interval is really what we refer to as an error of measurement. It is a way of guesstimating through good statistical procedures the likelihood we have made an error, the factors that we haven't accounted for that could have resulted in a different score if this had been filled in by a different person on a different day, if we had explained it in a slightly different method, or something as nebulous but probably important as the relationship between the therapist and clinician and the parent filling it in. In other words, the confidence interval refers to the likelihood that the score did actually fall where the scores were in this questionnaire, or in fact they could have been somewhere else. The The confidence interval really gives you a range to which it is probable or possible that the scores may have in fact fallen if you had done it with somebody else on another day, explained it in a different way, or in fact just had a different relationship with the person who was completing it. That confidence interval will be found in the scoring section of the manual, and it will usually be a plus-minus score. So for example, plus or minus 5. And what they're saying is that that composite score that you got, or that percentile rank that you got, so for example, the child falls at the 5th percentile, or the composite score they got was 65, that really, to be truly accurate, we need to add or minus the score to give a range. So the 65, if it had a plus or a minus of 5, would mean that really we feel the score could have been anywhere from 60 to 70, given all the variables that may have influenced the completing of this questionnaire. So that error of measurement really says that for us to be certain of where this child's true abilities lie, we must put it into a range rather than as a single score. The reason that we refer to the 90% confidence and the 95th% confidence really is an artifice of the statistics that is used. Personally, I always use the 95th percentile. That is the best that we can have. What that means is that with 95% confidence, so with 5% lack of confidence, we believe that the range of scores represents this child's true ability. The reason this is so significant, and again, as said in the standardized testing section, the reason this is so significant is that too often we focus on the score rather than the range, knowing that the child's ability may in fact be somewhere along that range and not actually at the score that we gained. This becomes particularly important for the number of times that a child's range of scores with the confidence interval actually would place them in different categories. Category of average ability, the category of low average, or borderline, or low. So when we're making decisions of a child's ability, which is the way that most of the adaptive behavior scales and standardized testing is used, in fact, our ability to predict a child's ability by category is much more varied than the specific score might suggest. So again, we've been referring to the norm distribution curve. If you get a child who scores on their standard score, the composite score, in that domain area that is equivalent in IQ testing to say 75. If we then look at the confidence interval and note that it is plus or minus 5, for example, and typically when we're looking at the 95th percentile, it is usually more like 6 or 7, what you'll notice is that that means that the child's score could in fact range from 68 right up to 82. That means that that score of 75 is suggesting that if we're to be relying on that there could be error in our measurement, the child's true ability could in fact vary across 3 separate categories of ability. So therefore, when we are using a questionnaire, an adaptive behavior scale, as a way of verifying if a child has a certain diagnosis, for example, a general learning disability, or if we're trying to identify that the child has developmental delays of such significance that they warrant being in an early intervention service, which is typically defined as they're in the bottom 2.2% of ability. If this is what we're using our questionnaire for, we need to be quite cautious in the way that we are interpreting the scores and ensuring that we're looking at that confidence interval carefully. However, perhaps wish to extend our thinking around adaptive behaviour scales, that they can be in fact significantly more than simply a score to verify a child's diagnosis or place them into a category of ability. One of the ways that we can use questionnaires is in fact as a structured interview to gain qualitative information about a child's ability. In other words, it is a good way of gathering a lot of information about what a child can and can't do as we attempt to develop a profile of their abilities and their challenges. If that is the case, if we are looking at it as more as qualitative rather than quantitative, if we're looking at it as it gives us detail rather than simply a score in domains or an overall ability compared to other children of the same age, then yes, we can hand it out to be completed at home before meeting the child. It can be sent out once we've agreed that we're going to do the development assessment. It is something that we can get a parent to complete that is providing us answers to a whole series of very specific questions about what a child can and can't do. That gives us an initial impression of where this child might be. This has a number of advantages. One, it means that before you started even doing a parent, which can take considerable time, if you're going to ask each of these questions, or if you're going to go through a full developmental questionnaire, structured interview with them, you now already have many answers to those questions. It certainly allows you to range of where a child is at. It gives you a sense of roughly in the scale of ability a child might be, so it can allow you to focus your questions. What we mean by this is, if you have a child who's clearly from the questionnaire functioning extremely well and doing at average ability for most of the areas, then we don't need to spend considerable time exploring through interview questions about how they're doing with things like toileting, dressing, feeding themselves. It's a way of narrowing the focus of our questions to just the areas of which we need to do it. Or alternatively, if we're seeing that children is struggling with some abilities but doing very well with others, to gather more detail to flesh out or detail better what this means. Similarly, if we get a questionnaire returned back and we look at it, we score it up and we find that a child is functioning in the very lowest percentile and possibly even below the first percentile, for example, at the 0.05, the 0.5 or 0.01 percentile, which really is suggestive of a moderate to severe general learning disability, we also know that it's not fruitful. It's not fruitful for a parent, it's not fruitful for ourselves to spend lots of time asking questions about a child's development, because the answer for most of it is going to be no, they can't do it, which is demoralizing for a parent and also sucks up or soaks up a lot of precious time that you're going to have with a parent with questions that provide very little useful information. In other words, we can actually use a questionnaire to guide our time better, to use it more efficiently and more usefully to establish a relationship with a parent by having a good way of ranging where we need to focus our questions when we actually spend time with them. So handing out a questionnaire, sending it to the parents before we're actually going to talk to them, can in fact make the time we're going to spend with them better. It also serves another function, that it primes a parent before we're talking with them of the kind of information that we're looking for. It allows a parent to have time to orient and think about the answers to questions that when they're asked on the spot can be very hard for a parent to ask or take them quite a bit of time to think through. This not only makes it easier when we're talking with them, but also primes a parent to be thinking about this stuff so that they're able to provide greater detail in a much shorter period of time. One of the ways I particularly like to use these questionnaires is once we have identified we're going to do developmental assessment, particularly if it's with a parent who I don't know or haven't met before, is to give them a phone call and explain that this questionnaire is coming out, to emphasize the fact that it's just a piece of paper, it's not the Bible, and that they are not being tested on it. But it does provide some good information that makes the assessment process better, and that they just make their best guess at it, and please to write over the form any thoughts or questions that they have that they feel would be useful for me to know. And this again can gear up very well, or prime very well, when I actually am going to sit down with them face to face, or these days online, to discuss how their child is doing. And it also can give me the heads up on the sorts of areas that they're the most interested in wanting to discuss, or the areas where they're the least certain about. Therefore, I will need to put more thought into how to ask questions to help unpack or probe further how a child is actually doing in that area, for example, in communication. So in this way, adaptive behavior scales can be very useful in assessments. They can be a shorthand or a quick way of getting scores about a child that give you a guesstimation of where they're at. We're of course going to use them to verify and confirm what we do through direct testing. They also can be an excellent way of reducing the need for asking lots of questions to a parent, and priming both them and me for what to be focusing on when we get together. So I use it in this way. I use it very much as a way of enhancing the relationship that you need to have with a parent, so that when you're talking, you can focus the questions in the areas where it needs to be focused and ignore those areas that don't require it because you already have the information. It helps a parent prepare, and it provides me very concrete information for setting goals. It starts the conversation of a child's list of strengths and weaknesses, therefore what we may be focusing on for goals. And one of the things I might ask a parent to do is to write on the back of the form that is sent out, what are the areas of most concern? Just as a simple set of sentences of what are the areas that they're the most worried about that they've looked at in this questionnaire. The Vineland Adaptive Behaviour Scale is very similar to the Adaptive Behaviour Assessment System, but has a significant difference, one that I want to explore in a little bit more detail, because when I'm simply looking for scores or a shorthand way of gathering information, the Adaptive Behaviour Assessment System is a much easier one for parents to fill in, and a much more useful one for just getting those scores. If, however, what I want to do is use this questionnaire as getting a full profile of a child and starting a good in-depth conversation about where the child's strengths and weaknesses or challenges are, then the Vineland Adaptive Behaviour Scale has got some significant advantages. The Vineland Adaptive Behaviour Scale breaks its questionnaires into different formats, those which are to be completed by or through parent interview, those that can be completed by teachers, but more significantly, those that are in domain or subdomains or expanded interview form. The expanded interview form does not ask questions so much in subdomains, e.g. communication, self-care, going simply from a probe or a sample of skills from early infancy to that of the upper age limit, for example 6 years of age. It actually asks the questions in those smaller skill areas, for example in dressing, in eating, in toileting, and in safety. So it allows you to have a greater range of behaviors to have answered in each of those areas that allows you to have a better profile of how the child is actually doing with, for example, them feeding themselves, with dressing themselves. So in some ways, the Vineland has the same structure as the Adaptive Behaviour Assessment System. It has communication, daily living skills, socialization, and motor skills. They do, however, tend to break it up into more subdomains. For example, in motor skills, you get a clearer distinction between fine motor skills and gross motor skills. In daily living skills, there's a greater separation out between personal care, community skills, and domestic skills. But more specifically, it breaks down each of those subdomains into these smaller skill areas. So for example, if we just look at eating, if we just look at self-care, it's broken up into the early skills we see, which is beginning to eat, that is allowing the child to be fed by an adult, to the next steps of cooperating in dressing and washing, through to actually drinking and undressing and dressing and using tools, utensils to eat. In other words, it looks at each of these skills as separate areas, so it allows you to get a more detailed profile that is more useful when you're looking to set goals and is much closer to curriculum assessments such as the Carolina curriculum, the Portage, the Early Start Denver model, or the ABLES, in these distinct, discrete areas. When you want to see what a child is able to do, that allows you to target your goal within each one of those skills and to work out what the child is able to do on their own and not able to do by themselves, or what help they require. So in this way, it provides you significantly more detail when you want to set goals. Similarly, the Vineland has a greater rating scale. So it goes from 0 means that the child can never do it, through to that 4 where the child can do it almost always. Even by adding in one more rating scale, one more number in the rating scale, it provides you just a greater depth of understanding with each of those skills, each of those separate sentences, those separate questions, what a child is able to do. It gives you a more comprehensive understanding of who this child is. It allows you to have more information to talk about what a child is able to do, who they are, and where their challenges are with a parent, as well as just being able to set more specific goals. So for again, in communication, it breaks it up into the areas of beginning to talk, using their own name or using the names of other people, using sentences, and communicating important information about themselves, such as their name and age, to other people, and then looking at vocab as a separate area. Very similarly to curriculum-based assessments like the ABLES, like the Carolina, the simple scores that you give on each one of these sentences, each one of these questions, allows you to focus on what it is that you're going to do during intervention. One of the ways that you do this in curricular assessments is not just focusing on what the child can't do, but getting a sense, because these are still developmental, going from a skill in each of these areas, from a skill that is seen early in infancy to the skills that are seen in a much older child. It doesn't just give you a profile of where the child is up to, it gives you a focus of what the next thing to teach is, and therefore a way of monitoring specific progress over time, not just as a score, but the actual skills a child has acquired. And there is nothing quite as motivating and uplifting to a parent when after 3, 6, 12, or 18 months after you conducted the first developmental assessment, to go back over this scoring system with ratings on specific behaviors and to say, here are the 10, 15, 25, or 30 specific skills your child has learned in that time since receiving intervention and you've been doing this work. It allows for a completely different conversation to occur, one that I don't believe occurs with simply scores. So again, the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale has a very similar scoring system to that of the adaptive behavior system and most other adaptive behavior scales. It does have a few other columns that do provide slightly more variation or detail to which you can go to in describing a child's ability. But these again are just scores. A percentile score, adaptive level, age equivalency, These can be useful in some circumstances to say that the way that your child is in their communication skills, or the way they are in their ability to engage in the activities of everyday living, self-care, is equivalent to that which we see if you're typical, for example, if the child was 5 years of age, what we might see in your typical 3-year-old. This can give a very direct, though stark, comparison that allows a parent to understand this information that is a little better than simply a percentile score, which again, to say a child comes 5th out of 100 children, though it sounds bad, is not quite as direct or referential as saying, well, though your child is 5, the skills they have in taking care of themselves is eating, feeding, dressing and toileting is what we see with your typical 3-year-old. And again, the way that the age equivalent scores work is it's on the median, the 50th percentile, the score at that age of the midpoint. Now, this has a bright side or a light side and a dark side. The light side is this can be very helpful for parents. And many parents will actually say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's exactly what I thought. That when it comes to their social ability, I see that their 2-year-old sister is in fact doing better. So to say that their skills are at an 18-month level makes sense. It references well for them. It can be useful. It can also be a good way of communicating to parents that are struggling to understand what these scores all mean. The dark side can very much be that it can be very painful for a parent to hear that even though their child is 4 years of age, that the way that they are performing when you compare them is similar to that of a child who is significantly younger. And it can be at this moment that in fact they're getting a true understanding that when we talk about words which are very vague, like global developmental delay, delay in communication, learning disability, what we mean is something very stark, which is they are not developing in an okay way. So in the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale, as you would find in the Adaptive Behavior Assessment System and all other adaptive behavior scales, you'll have a chart at the end that allows you to place the child's scores on the norm distribution curve that will have it in terms of percentile and standard scores. And these will then be placed within categories: average, moderately low, low. When we use the word low, we understand that that refers to having a global developmental delay. We understand that is equivalent to having an intellectual disability. When we talk about average, we're talking about people who are operating within the middle of that distribution curve, and that's not the same as saying completely typical, because there are people who are in the moderately low, the moderately high, and the high category as well. One of the things that has shifted over the last 20 to 30 years is our tendency to use much more neutral terms like average, low, very low, moderately low. Whereas in years gone by, we would have used much more stark but understandable terms such as disability. So simply giving percentile scores or categories are not particularly meaningful to a parent on the whole. Some parents will understand exactly what it means, but the vast majority will not appreciate the significance of those categories and will require it to be translated in something that has more concreteness. What is often not clear to parents, something that we don't specify, that one of the reasons that we give these questionnaires is that we are using them as a way to put a score to verify, confirm, or use as evidence for our conclusion that the child has a diagnosis. Therefore, that where their score comes in is what says, yes, your child has a learning disability. Whereas all of the adaptive behavior questionnaires do tend to have standard scores for each of these subdomains, there is little research to verify or support the idea that this is particularly useful diagnostically. For example, it's hard to use this profile as a differential for autism. That is, there's a particular profile that's consistent, that indicates that a child will have autism, though there are some profiles that are shown to be more consistent. So, for example, having communication and social skills and play and leisure, for example, interpersonal relationships, significantly below some of their others. But you can see similar profiles with children with other difficulties as well. So whereas a profile might be consistent with a certain diagnosis, it is not particularly diagnosticable. So I suppose one way of looking at this is, what is the true use of a scatter analysis? That is looking at where the various subdomain scores fall in a profile, in a graph, to show where the relative strengths and weaknesses are. Though you can do this with the adaptive behavior scales, it's not entirely clear, and there's very little evidence to demonstrate that they have much utility in the assessment process and in terms of feedback. I suppose it provides a pretty graph, but other than that, it may be useful for some services that are very categorical in their way of identifying services. So what I mean by categorical is that if you see that a child is doing particularly poor relative, in example, coordination domain relative to their social domain, this might be evidence of why they'll get the occupational therapist as opposed to the speech and language therapist. I would be a little concerned of services that would rely on these scores to make those decisions, as opposed to just a simple profile of what the child can and can't do and good clinical judgment to say they require a speech and language therapist because they've got great difficulties in their ability to understand language or use words to talk, or in the pragmatics of their language, that is, interacting and conversing with other people. If we had to rely on such scores to actually verify this, I'd be a little concerned about the clinical capacity to simply evaluate children by meeting them and gathering information. But be as that may be one use some services put these questionnaires. On the whole, I don't see that happen. These subscales, these subdomain score profiles don't tend to be used very often. They may have a greater role in research, but in clinical settings don't seem to be as significant. So, adaptive behavior scales can serve a variety of purposes in a developmental assessment. They can be a way of structuring your interview with parents around adaptive behavior, that is, the activities of everyday life. They can be something you hand out to a parent prior to us meeting the child, prior to the interview, that helps frame the way you're going to conduct the assessment. It might give you verifiable evidence in each of the subdomains and domains that are part of the diagnosis. It can give you lists of strengths and weaknesses to focus on in describing the child and setting goals. It can be used as a way of measuring progress over time, both in terms of the score and just seeing what the child is able to do at a later point from when you did this initial developmental assessment. And it can be useful for providing a structure for your report. In other words, the subdomains and domains contained within adaptive behavior scales might be a neat way of actually structuring your report and talking about how a child is doing. We'll talk more about this in another section. Just very briefly, I want to talk about the Vineland Social Emotional Early Childhood Scales. I'm not aware of a more recent version of this. This one's quite old now, and when the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale was updated to its 3rd edition, I didn't see a 3rd edition of this one. But be as that may, the Vineland Social Emotional Early Childhood Scales takes the same approach as seen in the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale, but focuses in the one domain area of social ability, and really looks at skills in the interpersonal relationship, how a child relates to other children, how they play, and how they manage themselves with their emotion and behavior. So here are the questions that you're going to find within the Vineland Social and Emotional Early Childhood Scale. And even if you're not going to use the scores from this in a standardized way, what is very elegant about the Vineland Social Emotional Scale or Early Childhood Scale is that it breaks up the specific skills that you might see in a variety of areas or skill areas. It looks at the specific behaviors or skills you might see in a whole variety of specific skills within a subdomain. And that when you get these scores, what this particular scale does is it allows you to visualize it in a way that a child can see their scores across development chronologically, that is, the months and years of a child's development, the range of scores that you see typically for children. What we mean by this is that when you look at the subdomain area of play and leisure skills, it asks a series of questions that are developmental in nature. In other words, there's kind of skills you might see very early on in childhood, even infancy, right up to skills you see with older children. And it places them in a chronology so that when you get scores, you can see your child's score that range to the ages that you might see them. So there are a number of questions around a child's ability of playing with toys that will then give you a full score. In this case, a score that totals up to 8. And that when you get that score, if you look up to the top of the page, it shows you visually roughly where that score would be if you were to take the typical or midpoint range of ability for a child of that age. So for example, if you got a score of 8, that would show you that they're the kind of skills that you would expect from your typical 1 month old or 1 year old or 12-month old or 6-month old. And because the charts go across the row there in a chronological way, you can see the kind of different skills that happen sequentially as a child develops. It's just a very neat way of thinking about child development that works quite well for parents. I used to use this quite considerably in years gone by. Have stopped using it more recently simply because don't have more up-to-date standardized scores to verify it in the same way. When we think of adaptive behavior scales, we're talking about those that really are looking at the activities of daily living, as detailed here in communication, daily living skills, socialization, and motor skills. This is somewhat different from behavior rating scales that are seen in questionnaires such as the Conners or the Basque, where what you're looking for is ratings of behaviors that allow for more diagnosticable information, such as difficulties with attention, emotional control, hyperactivity. So adaptive behavior focuses on more the everyday skills of daily living, how well you're doing in your general development, whereas behavior rating scales focus much more on specific types of emotional behavioral difficulties that you can see with children. The most common ones are the Conners, the Basque, or the Behavior Assessment System for Children, which is currently in its 3rd edition and one that I would use relatively frequently, and the CARS or the GARS, which are 2 rating scales used typically for screening for autism. But these we'll discuss in another section. In conclusion, around adaptive behavior scales, I'll just make some final comments that we need to be very careful when we use questionnaires. They can be misunderstood by parents or not understood. And in this way, what we may find is that the information that we're getting is not reliable. I don't think that this is the case in the vast majority. I think this is a problem that does occur, but can interfere with the reliability of the information we're getting. So it is worth spending a little bit of time to cross-reference or check the information that we're getting in a questionnaire through follow-up interviewing. In other words, a quality assurance system to find out. So when you see some ratings around, for example, dressing or toileting, a simple question like, well, how are they going with their toileting? or describe how they use the toilet, you can then cross-reference that to see whether it matches well to what's been rated. Don't need to do that with every area, but doing it one or two gives you a good sense. One of the great failings of the questionnaires is that because they're just a series of questions, they do assume that the person who is rating it has an enormous amount of developmental knowledge, or has an understanding of the significance of those questions or what they're aiming to explore. This is not always the case. So there are times where, even though it may appear to be more efficient to have a parent fill in the questionnaire, at the end of the day, it's not more useful. We don't get better data. That actually we're better off if having conducted an interview and completed the questionnaire itself, or to use the questionnaire as an interview. My own view is, rarely can I see a situation of where it's a good idea to actually administer a questionnaire as an interview. I think there is nothing particularly rapport building about asking one question after another that are quite clearly being literally read from the script. If you're going to do it as an interview, then developing an interview technique of laddering, where you might start off with more broad questions such as, tell me about their toileting, and then knowing how to follow it up with more specific questions so that you're able to make the ratings, certainly makes more sense. So using your questionnaire as the thing that you're going to fill in by having a good process of interviewing probably is better at establishing rapport. One thing that we do need to be always aware of, either when we're interviewing or using questionnaires, is that if parents have particular agendas or beliefs, that this may be prejudicing the information that we're getting. This does not occur that often. I think that too many clinicians can worry about this occurring when it does not. But there are certainly situations that I would have experienced, as have other clinicians, with either because of the belief that the parent has about how their child is, their understanding of autism, or their agenda for this assessment, e.g. they want their child to get services, that can influence the way that they'll rate these questions. It is something to be mindful of, but also let us not look for shadows in the dark. Let us not look for situations where parents may have an agenda or a prejudice when they do not.